Let's look at the next element that we want to create. It is small debris, smoke, and fire. If you look at our final render, you can see that it really adds character to the shot. I really love those flames trailing after the large pieces. It's one of my favorite elements. You know what? I'm going to be saying it about every element, but I think it's a good thing. So I'm going to dive inside my effect small debris smoke, and what you see right now on my screen is the sourcing from which we will be sourcing our fire. So let's see how the sourcing was created. Let's go to the very top. First, we are bringing in the geometry of our broken helicopter through object merge. And first, I'm removing the tail and all the outside large metal pieces because I want the inside of the helicopter to be on fire and also this front part. And on the right side, as I mentioned, I am specifically removing the inside part because I want the flames really being there. Also, in our case, when the helicopter explodes, this area might get exposed and we don't have any props in there, so it would be good to just cover everything with fire. It will make our life easier. So here we merge our sources, and then we're going to measure the area of the pieces because we don't want to keep too small pieces that are too small, and also the area will control how much fire a piece emits. I'll show you that in a second. First, we're removing the pieces that are too small, controlling by area. Everything that is below 0.01 is removed. After that, we are splitting the tail, and what I'm doing is I'm creating density attribute separately. Here I'm adding simple noise for density, and it's okay that it goes from -1 to 1. Our final density is going to be normalized. For now, it's okay to have it in negative. So I'm creating density on those pieces, and then I'm creating density on the inside. But what I do here as well in this attribute wrangle is with a little bit of an expression, I am saying that this area gets less density and hence later less fire in the beginning, but as the time progresses, there will be more and more smoke and fire emitted. And the reason for that is, you can see I even wrote a note here, is because in the beginning I had it before without this control, and then we got just too much fire and we did not see any helicopter at all in the beginning. Everything was just covered in fire and smoke, and that was too much and the shot got boring. So we merge those two back together. And after that, we do a little bit more of an adjustment. As I told you, I want the pieces that are larger to have more fire and smaller, less fire. So I'm taking my area attribute and I'm promoting it from primitive to point. And after that, I'm adjusting the density. And here what I do is I create a number, I call it a buffer, and this number will be between 0 and 25. And what this number is going to do is pieces whose area are very, very small will have 0 buffer. And areas that are really, really big will have buffer up to 25. And then what I'm saying is, hey, density, I am gonna ramp you by frame number. And what I can do is, as the shot progresses, I will allow you to stay dense for longer if your area was closer to 25. If your area was closer to 0, your buffer is going to be 0. So by the end of the whatever number I'm going to put in here, you are going to die. And you can see actually I'm extending this number beyond the end of the shot because I ended up wanting more and more pieces to stay on fire even after the everything is on the ground, but I wanted pieces to keep emitting fire. So these are our pieces for scatter with the controls for density. After that, we're scattering points based on this density attribute. We're deleting all the attributes that we don't need. In this case, this is area. And after that, we are adjusting our velocity. Here is our velocity, and we are adding a little bit of noise to it. As I told you, I always like to add a little bit of noise to my velocity. And then let's add a little bit more adjustment to our velocity of the pieces. Remember, right now we are creating the source from our fire. And what I'm going to do here first, I'm going to try to group the areas that are facing the ground. So we had our normals on the points. If you look at it here, 1 second, I'm gonna go one level above. If you look at the normals, because we were scattering on the geometry that had normals on it, the normals information is stayed with the points. And now I'm gonna group the points that have normals facing down. And I'm using it for later because I want to isolate the pieces that would have fallen on the ground and their normals are facing the ground. So I don't want any fire emitted from them that fire will try to go into the ground. So that's why I'm grouping those areas. After that, I am creating a separate velocity that goes upwards. This is my custom V, it just goes upwards. So now on the left side, here incoming, we have the velocity after the pieces, the natural velocity, and with a little bit of noise, of course. And on the right side, we have our custom velocity that just points upwards. And in this adjust V when stopped in this node, what we will do is we will build a little logic here that will tell the pieces to keep their natural velocity as they're flying through the air, as they're moving, but in the moment where they come closer to the ground, when they stop, the velocity should, from the right side, the velocity pointing up should take over. Why are we doing that? So that when the piece is on the ground and it is slowed down and it's laying on the ground, we don't have any remnant velocity that shoots into the ground or shoots sideways and it looks strange and weird, because in real world, if you have a piece of something that fell on the ground, fire from it is going to be going upwards. And here you can see this piece of code, and all it does is first it calculates the speed of those points by computing the length of the velocity. After that, we are creating our custom field where we control what is the minimum speed, what is our threshold, and right now I'm setting it to 1 meter per second. So everything that moves faster than 1 meter per second then will have just its natural velocity of the point. But everything below will start taking our custom velocity that goes up. Here we are creating a float mix that is a simple fit between the speed of the point, its natural speed, and the speed that we set up here. And we are fitting it between 0 and 1. So when the point speed is closer, when the point speed is less than our minimum speed, less than 1 meters a second, then we are doing this little interpolation where we are interpolating between its original velocity and the velocity that goes up. And at the same time, if the point moves slower than our threshold, then we put it in a group that is called slow. Okay, after that, we have two groups now. We have a group that is called slow that we just created. And earlier here in the setup, we created the group that is facing down. Remember those pieces that had their normals facing down. So we have those two groups, so we can register two events. First, the piece is slow, and the second, the piece that's normals are facing down. So the piece is smack on the ground. We combine those two groups into a new group called remove, and after that we are blasting these points. So we cannot see it here because the pieces are still in the air and moving very fast. Let me just turn off the velocity and move a little bit further in the timeline where I see actually pieces on the ground. And let's look without the remove and with the remove. So we are removing some of the points that are facing down and that are slow. Okay, those points, they will not have any fire emitted from them. So this is a piece that fell facing the ground, no fire is needed. And we're just cleaning things up a little bit, removing those groups that we do not need anymore. And as usual, because we are sourcing here points from flying pieces, if I look through the camera, there's a bunch of pieces that are flying outside of the camera view. And in my case, I do not need them to be emitting anything because my camera it's moving a little bit, but not too much. It's not panning from left to right. I know that my camera, for example, is not going to go into this corner anymore. So I can just delete those points so that later when I do my pop sim, it is faster and not computing something that I'm not going to be using again. So I'm doing a simple camera call, where I create a volume from a camera. Simple volume from a camera, you can see it here. I'm giving it a little bit of a padding, 10% on each side, so that I don't cut it straight at the edge because the camera is still moving a little bit. And after that, I'm just grouping the points that are outside of this camera volume, and I'm removing those points. And after that, we are ready to create the sourcing for our fire. The setup that we use for the fire sourcing is really super simple. Let's take a look inside the popnet. I'm going to put my Houdini on manual and dive inside. And it's really a very basic setup. All we have here is our sourcing, the points that we created earlier. We are sourcing all the points that we have, and we are giving them a pretty short life expectancy with a little bit of variation. That's it. There was nothing else that was changed here, and the only thing we added is a little bit of a pop wind. That's it. The rest you can see is everything is very standard. Nothing was changed on the pop solver itself. I'm just adding here ground plane that imitates our ground, and this is our heli RBD, and we're using volume collisions here for our particles. We don't need any collision information afterwards, so we don't need any surface collisions here. Our points are not sticking, they're not doing anything. I just don't want them inside the pieces of the helicopter. So we have our volume here, and we are using volume sample mode. That's it. Let's go up. And after that, before caching, we are just deleting all the attributes we do not need. We know that later we might need our normals again. I always try to keep them. We are keeping velocity, age, area, density, ID, and life. You will see why later, especially area and stuff like that. So after that, let's take a look what we have. I'm going to go back into my auto mode, and this is what we have. You have your pieces. Let me just actually find my pieces of the geometry. I'm going to template them. So let's go back a little bit. And we can see here a piece of the front of the helicopter, and you have some trailing points after it. So it's very simple. These are our points. They are spreading a little bit in all directions because we added some wind to our pop sim. As I said, the setup is very simple. After that, we're doing the usual like we did before. We're going to group everything outside of our camera view with a little bit of padding. I'm deleting all those points outside of the camera frustum. And after that, I'm adding a little bit of a nice touch. You can do without it. I did experiments where I used this sourcing as it is, but it just felt a little bit boring to me. That's why I decided to add a little bit of noise into the points that are further away from the pieces of the helicopter. Obviously, we do not want to add any noise very close to the surface of the pieces because we want it to feel like the fire is attached to the pieces. But as the fire travels away, I want to add a little bit of a noise to break up some of the shapes, especially in the areas where everything is moving very fast, like here. And some sourcing felt to me just too straight and a little bit too boring. So what I did here, first I created a color attribute based on our age. You probably already know an age attribute. This is an intrinsic attribute, which is basically divides your current age by life. And we can always access this attribute. So I'm using the reverse of this attribute so that when I have the pieces that are just born, they will be at 1 in red. They will be completely red. And when the pieces are getting older, they are turning black. So it's pretty simple. Here, just 2 lines of code. First, make everything black. Second, areas that are just born, make them red. Areas that get older, make them black. Okay? After that, I am adding some noise on all the pieces, on all the points. Let me show you with and without. You see how we are adding a little bit more character to those lines of points after the pieces. They're looking a little bit more interesting. But as I told you, I don't want this breakup to happen right at the edges of the pieces, because then it will look like the fire is disconnected. That's why I will use my color attribute, and I will use it in my LORP function. So here it is. We are saying that when you're completely red, keep your original position. But when you get darker, then you can take on your position from the first input, which is our noised position. So if we look with and without, we're adding the noise when points are further away from the point. That's it. And the usual, we're deleting the attributes that we don't need. And after that, let's jump into creating the attributes that we will need for our pyro simulation, because these are the points. We will turn them into a volume and we will run them through a pyro solver. So what do we need usual when we want to create this kind of a fire? We will need some density and some burn. I will add the density right away, because after the explosion happened, I imagine there will be some dark smoke that right away is going to follow those pieces. So let's start with this density. Let me visualize the density. And what I'm using here is our simple age attribute. And you remember when we opened our solver, I'm just going to go into manual mode and dive into the solver. On the pop source, we had our life expectancy and the life variance, which means that any given point, the longest it can ever live is the sum of those two parameters. So 0.25 seconds is maximum a point will ever be alive. And I will take this number and I will consider it the oldest possible age. Let me go back to auto update mode. And this is what I'm using here in my max age parameter. These are two values that I'm referencing from the solver. 0.25. The oldest a point can live. And then I'm saying that my density will be this age ramped between 0 and this number. And I'm changing the density to 1 to from 1 to 0.3. It means that when you are just born, you're at density at 1. As you're getting older, the density goes all the way to 0.3. After that, let's create some temperature here. Let me visualize it. Temperature is simple noise. Just simple noise with a little bit of animation. That's it. Temperature attribute. And then we are creating p-scale attribute. Let me visualize our p-scale. Actually, no point even of visualizing it, because here I'm setting p-scale as a constant, 0.03. This is starting p-scale from which we will work later. After that, as we said, when we need a sourcing for fire, we will need burn. Here, I actually am doing it in 2 steps. First, I'm creating an attribute called trail temperature, and after that, I'm just turning it into burn. You can skip that. It was a part of my experimentation when I thought I might need an extra attribute for sourcing. But really what you can do is just replace this with burn and go ahead. But I left it here because that was just a part of my thought process. So here is our trail temperature, and what it is, it just ramps the age from 0 to maximum age. It's the same max age here as we had before, reference from the solver. And I'm also multiplying this max age by area, which means that smaller the piece, smaller this number is going to be, and faster trail temperature is going to turn to 0, which means that smaller pieces will have less fire emitted from them, less temperature, which is logical. I don't want too much fire on a tiny piece like this somewhere, a tiny piece like this. I don't want too much fire from it. Larger pieces will have more fire. That's all there is to this logic. And I'm adding a little bit of noise to this trail temperature. Let me visualize it. This is our trail temperature now. That's it. So we have our fire is emitted only close to the pieces of the helicopter, which is what it would be in real life. And after that, as I told you, I'm just turning it into burn. So now whatever we are seeing in the screen is actually assigned to burn attribute. Let's double check how it will look when we turn it into volumes. And here is a little tricky part. If I just visualize volume rasterize attributes, I'm rasterizing quite a few of them: density, velocity, temperature, and burn. And very often when I visualize my volume rasterize attributes, what happens is there's velocity attribute here as well, which might, you can see all those white values because velocity is a vector, and when we visualize it, it doesn't show me a true representation how visually this volume is going to look. I like to often just remove the velocity attribute and look at it this way. Let's give it a second. This is the resolution of my volume, and that's how my smoke is going to look. And I created here a little bit more visualization where I'm showing my fire emission areas, how they are going to look. Looks good to me. Again, it was trial and error, and in the end I came to this state. And one thing you probably know that is a little bit annoying when we work with volume rasterize attributes. Very often we need to go back and forth to our particle scale to make sure that the voxel size and the particle scale is proper for our scene. And what I did here, remember earlier I created this p scale. This is not a number that I just magically knew what to set it to. It was again experimentation, and how I like to test my particle scale is by using the sprite node. And I'm just adding the sprite to my points. And when I change my particle scale to, for example, something bigger here, you will see my sprite visualizes how approximately it will look when I turn it into volume. So that's a quick way how I do that. Okay, we have our volume. We have our volume with velocity, with temperature, with density, and with burn attributes, and we are ready to go into the simulation. Let's see, before we jump into it though, remember we have a few more velocity fields that we want to take into account. One of them was the wind from the top rotors. Here it is. This is the wind that we ramped actually. In the beginning is really strong, and then over time, by maybe in 30-35 frames after the start of the explosion, it slows down because our rotors slow down in the simulation. So here I have a switch which references this moment where we slow down our rotor velocity, and when it is completely turned into 0 in our rotor velocity setup, that's when I'm switching it to null so that it's faster. My simulation does not need to source. Just in case there are some stray voxels or very, very weak values, I don't want them to be computed. Yeah, I know the moment where I just can disregard this force. And after that, we also have our explosion force, which in the beginning will affect how our trailing density, smoke, and fire will behave, because our initial velocity from the explosion is really, really strong. So what I do here, I import my explosion. I remove everything but the velocity. Here, just for my own convenience, I rename it to explosion velocity. Later, so that I know it's easier for me to source it in the solver. I know what I'm sourcing here, just explosion velocity. And that's it. And after that, I'm just deleting the attributes that I'm keeping the attributes, only the ones that I need, position and name, so that in the merge, I don't have any conflicts when I'm merging all those sources. So now if I look here, I have my burn density, temperature, and velocity from the source. I have the top rotor wind, and I have my explosion velocity. We have all the sources we need, and now we are ready to sim. Now that all our sources are ready and all our velocity fields are ready, let's take a look at what were the settings of the pyro solver that we used. Let me just go into the manual mode and let's take a look at this pyro solver. Let's start with our setup. The usual, the voxel size here is linked to the voxel size of our source. This is the standard workflow. Nothing was changed here. You can see that there is maximum substeps that was increased, which means that we just want a little bit more information between the frames when the fire is computed. And again, it is like with the explosion. I did some experiments with increasing the global substeps, checking if I need more information between the frames from the sourcing itself, but it looked like with one global substeps I'm good, but what I needed is more information between the flames. Let me just show you the final result. What I wanted is more information in the flames themselves, because with, for example, one substep in the solver, what was happening is the flame looked too choppy and the lines did not look continuous. So with experiments back and forth, 3 was the good number that I decided to use in the end. Let me go back to the manual mode. The collisions we're using SDF and volume velocity, like the usual. Here in the collisions, we have our Heli RBD sim. It is in the manual mode, but you've seen that before. This is me just referencing the volume from our RBD simulation. And we have our building's volume. Remember, we are splitting the two and we are using the volume directly inside the solver. Remember, if it is red, it means something was changed inside. And this is our collider buildings. Exactly the same process that we did before. So these are the collisions, and the ground plane I'm just referencing from the bullet solver. In our case, it is at 0, so it doesn't really matter. But if it was a little bit of a different setup, or we're imagining you're working on a different shot, your ground might be at a different level. Let's look at the sourcing. What are we actually sourcing? All the stuff that we created before: density, temperature, sourcing the burn into flame, your usual setup for fire. I ended up not using the velocity from the source because I was getting really mushroomy look because the pieces are moving very strong. The velocity is very strong on them. In the end, without this velocity, the result seemed nicer to me than with it. And of course, we're sourcing our top rotor wind and our explosion velocity. I ended up ramping the explosion velocity, using it at 0.2 at the start, and then going all the way to 0, 30 frames after the start of the simulation. Because there were some areas of the explosion, for example, the wind downwards, that was still affecting things, and it was looking a little strange. So it went all the way to 0 after 30 frames. After that, let's take a look at our fields. What we have is quite increased dissipation. So 0.025 is our dissipation value, and our dissipation is controlled by temperature. So where we have temperature at 1, dissipation is at its minimum at 0. And when the temperature is at 0, then dissipation is highest, which means hot areas are not going to dissipate and colder areas are going to start dissipating. The usual. Then we have our emission from flame. So we're allowing some density, some smoke to be emitted from the flame. And again, that was back and forth experiments. And I felt in some areas it was nicer when the flames were emitting smoke. It looked more natural. It looked like there was some really maybe fuel inside the helicopter that was then set on fire. And then here at the bottom, we just have our flame that lives for 3 seconds. And in the shape, we have, of course, our buoyancy because it's really hot. We want stuff to keep rising up. We have our disturbance that I tend to ramp it, for example, in the beginning to have it really strong, and then make it much calmer. Here it is 25 frames into the simulation. And of course, I'm using speed field as the control. So where you have areas that are moving 50 and beyond, they will have your maximum disturbance, and then as the speed goes to 0, the disturbance goes to 0. And we have a similar ramp in our turbulence. It starts with really high turbulence, and it's nice because it gives a really interesting push in the beginning, and then we simulate it to look more like it's ambient wind, especially in our case when we have pieces flying around, where we have the wind from the rotors, this turbulence, the still presence of turbulence, it looks good in the end. And we are also adding some shredding because we are dealing with fire here. And that's pretty much it. The usual look we don't care because we will create our own look in LOPs in a second. And the usual in the output, let's make sure that we're converting everything to VDBs. We're using 16-bit float, and we are downsizing our velocity. After that, here everything is cached. I'm just going to go back into my auto mode to show you the results. Here is your cached fire with smoke. And I'm using VDB clip here to remove the areas outside the camera frustum with a little bit of padding. Because in this case, there might be some, what if there was some stray flame that moved really far away from camera? We do not need to render it. So here we have a note to go and check our LOP test 008. So let's follow the instructions and let's do that. I'm pressing 4 on my keyboard as I set my quick marks here in LOPs. And it is trying to load something. It means I did not follow my own rules and I did not set my visibility and template flags onto null before I left this area. So now I'm suffering after my own mistakes, but at least it didn't take that long. So let's take a look what we have here. This is our LOP test 008, and I'm checking this merge. Let's look through the camera, and let's look through Karma XPU. Okay, you see our buildings are blown out just because there are no textures on them, and they seem very, very reflective. So what's happening here is a process that we went through earlier. Remember, we have our pieces from the helicopter that are using deformation motion blur. On the explosion, on all the smokes and on the fires, we do not need to compute deformation motion blur. We just need velocity motion blur. So here I'm just using, do not need this bug. I'm just using render geometry settings where I say no velocity blur. It will overwrite any settings down the line. And after that, I have my material library. If I dive inside, I'm using the same explosion materials. Nothing changed from before. You can create your own material here for the fire. Make it cool, make it awesome, make it yours. I'm just using the same explosion material in this case. And let's take a look how everything looks after materials are assigned. Let's see, I'm getting some kind of an error here. Hell explosion is not here. I kept the material assignment, but we are looking only at the fire. So never mind, you can disregard that. But here you can see we have our piece of the helicopter. Obviously, it's super motion blurred, but we have some fire that conforms to the shape of the piece. We have some fire right behind smaller pieces. You can see it especially here. And we have this fire that has some smoke trailing after it. It's a good combination of fire and smoke. So let's go a little bit further, see how it looks a little bit further into our scene. Houdini took a few seconds to compute, and mostly because of the deformation motion blur on the pieces of the helicopter, because there are quite a few of them. So here we see our smoke. Here I can see that it is swirling. It is being affected by the rotor force. That's nice. And here we have both smoke and the fire going downwards. And here we have the fire from the center of the helicopter. So everything is working as expected. I highly encourage you to go tweak the shaders yourself and see. Maybe you want a little bit less fire. You can change the ramps. You can obviously increase the maybe blackness of the smoke, make it darker, make it look like it's totally fuel that was set on fire. As usual, just make it yours, make it unique, play around, experiment. Just a reminder, it is here in the material library. This is the explosion material we're using right now. Go copy it, create your own small piece of smoke material, and go experiment with it.